The carpet was always that particular shade of green. Not quite olive, not quite sage, the kind of color that seemed designed to disappear into memory even while you were looking at it. Mrs. Henderson had been staring at the same worn patch near the receptionist's desk for nearly an hour, watching the way the afternoon light filtered through the Venetian blinds and cast thin lines across the waiting room floor. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune overhead, that gentle electrical whisper that had become the soundtrack to waiting. It was Tuesday, just past 2:30, and the waiting room held its usual collection of quiet souls, each carrying their own careful burden of uncertainty. Dr. Morrison's office had occupied the same spot on Elm Street for 23 years. The waiting room had been redecorated only once in all that time, sometime in the early 70s when they'd added the new chairs with their burnt orange fabric and dark wood frames. The magazines on the coffee table were always several months behind, their pages softened by countless nervous fingers. Ladies' Home Journal, Reader's Digest, Canadian Living, publications that spoke of orderly homes and manageable problems, a comforting contrast to the unknowing that brought people here. Mrs. Henderson adjusted her purse strap and glanced at the clock. The hands seemed to move with deliberate slowness, as if time itself understood the weight of waiting. She had been coming to these appointments for 3 months now, ever since that morning when she'd found what she thought might be a lump. She hadn't told Harold. Not yet. There seemed no point in worrying him until she knew for certain what it meant. The memory of that discovery still came to her in quiet moments, the way her fingers had paused during her morning routine, the sudden stillness that had filled the bathroom, the careful way she'd continued getting dressed as if nothing had changed. For weeks afterward, she'd found herself touching the spot unconsciously, checking, hoping she'd been mistaken. But the appointments had followed, one after another, each bringing its own small revelations and new questions. Pettigrew sat with his hat balanced carefully on his knee, his weathered hands folded over the brim. He came every 6 weeks for his blood pressure. Though the real reason, the dizziness that had been getting worse, the way his vision sometimes blurred, that was something he kept to himself. At 72, he'd learned that some worries were better carried alone. His wife didn't know about the episodes, the way he sometimes had to grip the banister when climbing the stairs, or how he'd started sitting down to put on his shoes because standing made the world tilt unexpectedly. He'd watched his father grow old with dignity, never complaining, never burdening the family with every ache and uncertainty. That was how men of his generation handled these things, quietly, with grace, keeping the larger worries to themselves until they absolutely couldn't anymore. The receptionist, Mrs. Cole, had been at her desk for nearly as long as the office had existed. She typed with a rhythmic precision that had become part of the room's atmosphere, the gentle tapping of keys mixing with the hum of the lights and the soft tick of the wall clock. She knew everyone who came through those doors, knew their appointment patterns and their quiet anxieties, but she maintained the professional distance that was expected. Some knowledge was meant to stay behind the reception desk. Over the years, she developed an intuitive understanding of the different types of waiting. There was the routine waiting of regular checkups, calm and predictable. There was the anxious waiting of new symptoms, filled with careful observation and contained worry. And there was the heavy waiting that came with follow-up appointments, when people returned to learn what their tests had revealed. Each type of waiting had its own rhythm, its own particular quality of silence. Young Mrs. Patterson sat near the window, her appointment book open in her lap, though she wasn't really reading it. She was 28 and pregnant with her second child, though this pregnancy felt different somehow, more tired, more uncertain. The doctor had mentioned some tests, spoken in that careful way that doctors had perfected, concerned but not alarming, thorough but not frightening. She found herself counting the weeks, calculating dates, holding conversations in her mind that she couldn't have out loud. Her first pregnancy had been textbook perfect, filled with excitement and careful preparation. This time the tiredness came earlier and stayed longer. The morning sickness lingered past the expected weeks. When Dr. Morrison had suggested additional monitoring, she'd nodded and agreed with the same composure she brought to everything else in her life. But late at night, when her husband was sleeping and the house was quiet, she found herself placing both hands on her belly and whispering small prayers into the darkness. The waiting room held its own particular silence, not the empty quiet of an unused space, but the full silence of people thinking, worrying, hoping. It was the sound of breath being held, of hands clasped together, of hearts beating just a little too quickly. It was the silence of people who had learned to keep their fears neat and contained, who understood that some things were better left unspoken until they absolutely had to be said. Mrs. Henderson remembered when she was young, how her own mother had spoken of medical visits in hushed tones, as if the very words might invite trouble. "We'll see what the doctor says," was the standard response to any health concern, followed by weeks of careful observation and quiet worry. It was a generation that had learned to endure, to wait, to hope for the best while preparing for something else entirely. Her mother had carried her own secrets for months before finally telling the family about the persistent cough that wouldn't go away. By then, it was too late for the treatments that might have helped earlier. Mrs. Henderson had learned from that experience the importance of catching things early, of not waiting too long. But she'd also inherited her mother's tendency to shoulder worry alone, to protect others from uncertainty until certainty arrived. The door to the inner office opened, and Mr. Watson emerged, his face carefully neutral. He nodded to Mrs. Cole, scheduled his next appointment in a voice just above a whisper, and left without making eye contact with anyone in the waiting room. That was the unspoken protocol. You preserved others' privacy by looking away, by pretending you hadn't noticed the way someone's hands were shaking, or how long they'd been waiting. Mr. Watson had been coming for months, ever since the company physical had revealed irregularities in his blood work. Each visit brought new tests, new questions, new careful explanations about what they might mean. He'd stopped mentioning the appointments to his colleagues, had learned to schedule them during his lunch break so no one would notice his absence. The weight of not knowing had become as much a part of his routine as his morning coffee and evening newspaper. Mrs. Henderson was called next. She gathered her purse, her coat, and the small notebook where she'd written down her questions, the ones she could bring herself to ask. As she walked toward the inner office, she could feel the eyes of the other waiting patients following her, not out of curiosity, but out of that shared understanding of what it meant to cross that threshold, to move from the safety of not knowing into the territory where answers lived. The hallway between the waiting room and the examination rooms was brief but significant, a transitional space where people gathered their courage or their composure. The walls were lined with diplomas and certificates, reassuring symbols of competence and care. But Mrs. Henderson found herself looking past them, focusing instead on the sound of her footsteps on the linoleum floor, the quiet closing of doors, the sense of moving from one world into another. The examination room was smaller, warmer, more intimate than the waiting area. The paper on the examination table crackled slightly as she settled herself, and she found herself listening to the sounds from the waiting room, the soft murmur of conversation, the turning of magazine pages, the gentle rhythm of Mrs. Cole's typing. It was strange how those sounds that had felt so heavy with anxiety now seemed almost comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her uncertainty. Morrison had kind eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and he spoke with the measured cadence that came from years of delivering news both good and difficult. He asked his questions with gentle thoroughness, his hands gentle during the examination, his manner professional but not distant. Still, Mrs. Henderson found herself holding her breath, as if the act of breathing might somehow influence what he would find. He spoke about next steps, about additional tests that would provide more clarity. His voice carried the particular tone that doctors used when they wanted to be reassuring without making promises they couldn't keep. Mrs. Henderson nodded at the appropriate moments, asked her prepared questions, and received answers that were both helpful and somehow incomplete. There would be more waiting ahead, more appointments, more questions that would need answering. When the appointment was over, when she had her next appointment scheduled, and her questions answered as much as they could be, Mrs. Henderson returned to the waiting room to put on her coat. The same people were still there. Mr. Pettigrew with his hat, Mrs. Patterson with her appointment book, Mrs. Cole at her desk. The fluorescent lights still hummed their quiet tune, and the afternoon light still filtered through the blinds in those familiar thin lines. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and looked back at the room that had held her worry for the past hour. In 2 weeks she would return for her test results, and the cycle would begin again, the waiting, the wondering, the careful management of hope and fear. But for now, she stepped out into the afternoon sunshine, carrying her uncertainty a little differently than she had when she'd arrived. The afternoon brought its own rhythm to the waiting room. Mrs. Patterson was called for her appointment, gathering her things with the particular care that came with pregnancy. Her footsteps were softer now, more deliberate, as she made her way down the hallway. Mr. Pettigrew adjusted his position in his chair, checked his watch, and returned to the patient's stillness that had become his natural state during these visits. Mrs. Cole continued her typing, occasionally answering the phone with the warm professionalism that had made her an institution within the office. She scheduled appointments, confirmed times, spoke in the careful language of medical administration. Between calls she organized files and updated records, maintaining the systems that allowed the office to function smoothly while people navigated their various uncertainties. Back in the waiting room, the pattern continued. Mr. Pettigrew was called next, his name spoken in Mrs. Cole's familiar voice. He rose slowly, carefully, his movements showing the caution that had become second nature. Mrs. Patterson, now returned from her appointment, settled back into her chair by the window, a new appointment card in her hand, an expression that suggested both relief and continued concern. The late afternoon brought different visitors, people finishing work early for medical appointments, retirees who preferred the quieter hours, individuals whose schedules had been built around the necessity of regular monitoring. Each brought their own particular version of medical waiting, their own careful balance of hope and preparation. Mrs. Thompson arrived for her regular appointment, her arthritis making the simple act of sitting down a careful negotiation with her body. She'd been coming for years, had watched other patients come and go while her own condition remained manageable but persistent. There was a particular grace in her acceptance, a way of carrying chronic uncertainty that spoke to years of practice. The room held them all in its quiet embrace, a space designed for the particular kind of time that existed between not knowing and knowing, between question and answer. The afternoon wore on, marked by the gentle progression of appointments and the slow movement of the sun across the windows. People came and went, each carrying their own careful portion of medical uncertainty, each finding their own way to wait. The afternoon wore on, and gradually the waiting room emptied, patient by patient, worry by careful worry. Mrs. Cole straightened the magazines, turned off the coffee pot, and prepared to close the office for another day. Tomorrow would bring its own collection of quiet anxieties, its own careful hopes and contained fears. The waiting room would be ready for them, with its green carpet and humming lights, and the particular silence that understood what it meant to wait. As the sun shifted lower in the sky, the thin lines of light across the floor grew longer and softer. The room settled into the stillness of evening, holding the echoes of all the waiting it had witnessed, all the unspoken prayers and careful hopes that had filled its chairs and paced its floor. In the morning it would wake again to the sound of footsteps and quiet voices, ready to hold whatever worries people brought through its door. The waiting room knew its purpose, had learned over the years to be exactly what it needed to be, a space between certainty and uncertainty, between the comfort of not knowing and the necessity of finding out. It had witnessed tears that came after good news and the particular stillness that followed difficult diagnoses. It had held the hands that reached for each other across the space between chairs and the silence of people who didn't know what to say to each other or to themselves. And in its own quiet way, it had learned to be enough comfort for the frightened, enough space for the uncertain, enough time for people to gather their courage or their acceptance. It was a room that understood the weight of waiting and the particular grace required to endure the space between question and answer, between fear and resolution.